Okay, well, time flies, and I think we've got our critical mass. So we'll get the show on the road. My name's Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second session in our three-part Creating Impactful Climate Transition Plans webinar series that we've organized in collaboration with the Transition Plan Taskforce. If you're joining us for the first time today, a bit of housekeeping to get us started. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the session ends, probably a day after the session ends, but fear not, it will be coming to you. Also, we are in webinar mode, and so that means our attendees will be muted and cameras off throughout. But we still want to hear from you, and there's a couple of ways to do that. Obviously, many of you have found the chat box, and let's keep that going. Feel free to say hello, to share your LinkedIn profile if you want to do some networking. If you're having any technical difficulties and you need to get a hold of us, that would be the place to let us know. And especially if you want to comment on anything that you're hearing, fire that into the chat. If you want to ask a question that our esteemed panelists will address during the Q&A session after the presentations, then that has to go into the Q&A box. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a button there that you can open the Q&A. That's the place for questions. If you put them in the chat, we'll just have to ask you to move them over. We can't move them over for you. Zoom doesn't allow that. And the main reason we want questions in the Q&A box is that you can vote for the questions that you want us to answer. And that's really important. We're expecting literally hundreds of people on this call, and probably more questions than we're going to have time to answer. So your help in prioritizing those questions is vital. Keep an eye on the Q&A box. If you see a question that looks interesting, just give it a thumbs up, and that will help to move it up to the top and improve the likelihood that we will address it in the Q&A. We've activated automatic captions, which you can choose to accept in the toolbar, again, at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are generated automatically by Zoom, and we ask your forgiveness for any typos or mistakes that are made. And finally, if you would like to post on social media about the session, and we sure hope that you will, please make sure to tag us and use the hashtag CICTP 2023 and hashtag transition plans, just so that we can attract as much attention to this important content as possible. That information has been posted in the chat, but I see it's already disappeared quite quickly, so we may have to post it again, or you may have to just scroll up a little ways to find it again. Yeah, much appreciated if you're doing socials. Okay, let's get started on with the next slide, please. As I said, this webinar is being brought to you by the UN Global Compact Network UK. We're part of the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with more than 20,000 participating companies globally. Our initiative is built on company CEOs committing to our 10 universal principles for responsible business that have been drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Our role at the UK network is to support UK-based members to fulfill these commitments. I say this at all of our webinars, so I'm not going to take up more time now. We're putting some links into the chat. If you'd like to learn more about how to join the Global Compact, or if you're already a member, how to get more value from that membership and all of the programming that we offer, do please check out those links and get in touch if you need some more information. Let's go to the next slide, please. A key part of our mission is to drive business engagement with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The goals provide a comprehensive and coherent roadmap to create the future we want, and business must be actively engaged if we're going to achieve the sustainable world we're striving for. As with last week's session, the content and themes of this webinar are particularly linked to Goal 13, and by extension, Goals 14 and 15. And because we're talking about action this week, We're also likely to touch on goal 7 and goal 9 and goal 12. But of course, the goals are quite interlinked. And so really, whatever issue around sustainability you're keen on, you can draw a really clear link back to today's topic. And so now let's get on to today's topic. As we covered last week, more and more businesses are setting science-based targets to reduce their carbon emissions and achieve net zero. Well, now we're asking companies to move to the next step and develop credible transition plans that include detailed roadmaps of how the business will transform to meet their goals. The Transition Plan Taskforce disclosure framework and guidance is supported by 3 guiding principles: ambition, action, and accountability. And last week we looked at ambition. Today we will be tackling what the heart of the transition is about: action. So to this end, we ask that you please try to focus your questions on that second pillar. Save your questions on accountability, for example, anything about metrics or target setting, for the last webinar that's coming next week. If you have questions about ambition, you can find the recording of last week's webinar on our website, and the link has just gone into the chat. We are very lucky to be joined by a superb panel of speakers today who are going to help us understand that action element in more detail and to outline what their companies are doing to fulfill it. First up, we're going to hear from Poensgen, the technical lead from the Transition Plan Taskforce Secretariat. Then we have Harriet Howey, the global head of ESG insights at Diageo. And lastly, Supriya, Sobti, climate and purpose lead from the NatWest group. All right, a lucky day for us to have such great speakers. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Ira to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Steve. I'd say let's dive right into the next slide. So as Steve outlined, there's kind of these 3 core principles that the TPT is structuring the recommendations around. These are ambition, action, and accountability. Last time, my colleague Kate spoke more about ambition and what the TPT means by that. Today, we want to zone in on that second principle, which is that we think that a good practice transition plan should really focus on concrete actions which emphasize the short term and strive for resilience. And today I want to talk through that a little bit more and unpack what it is that we mean by that. Can we go to the next slide? Again, kicking off with a bit of a refresh and a reminder, and setting out kind of some of the key concepts that the TPT is structuring its recommendations around. On the one hand, we have 3 principles that we think companies should be following as they develop their transition plan. And secondly, we then say that a really good and credible and robust transition plans needs to take what we call a strategic and rounded approach. So what we mean here is that we think it's incredibly important that firms really think holistically around the role that they can play in the economy-wide transition, and prioritize those areas of actions where they could really drive meaningful impact. We set out in our guidance documents, we set out 3 different channels through which we think firms can do that, focusing on their own entity level decarbonization, thinking more holistically around what are they doing to respond to climate-related risks and opportunities. And then finally, the 3rd channel around really prioritizing actions to contribute to the economy-wide transition. Now, this and the 3 principles is really the overarching conceptual framework around which all of our recommendations are structured, and from which our disclosure framework then follows, and in terms of what we recommend as the constituent pieces of a credible transition plan. And if we go to the next slide, again, this is just a bit of a scene-setting reminder. This is what the TPT disclosure framework actually looks like. As you see, we have the 3 principles running across the top. We make some recommendations around stages that a company might move through as they develop their transition plan. And then we recommend these 5 elements that we think companies should be disclosing around as they communicate their transition plan to the market, starting off from foundations, implementation strategy, engagement strategy, metrics and targets, and finally on the governance piece. And the focus today is, if we go to the next slide, focuses on these middle 2 pillars. So this is where we think really the action lies. It's in a company's implementation strategy and in its engagement strategy. And so the way that I want to talk through is I want to run through the constituent parts of these two elements, and really just kind of outline what we think the kind of considerations are that companies should be making as they develop the action pieces of their transition plan. So let's let's move to the actual meat and kick off with implementation strategy. So this, if we move to the next slide. All right, I want to spend a bit of time unpacking this. So last week we talked about ambitions, which generally land under the foundations element of our framework, which is where we think a company should set out what are its long-term objectives and targets that it's moving towards. The implementation strategy element is then around essentially everything that the firm is doing internally to help achieve its objectives. So some of the considerations that we think companies should be making as they flesh this out is thinking through what are the short, medium, and long-term actions that you are planning to take to actually deliver on your ambition. So depending on the profile of the company, these might be actions taken to accelerate the phase out of emissions-intensive assets. It could be investments that are taken in energy efficiency measures. It could be plans to switch to renewable power purchasing agreements, et cetera, right? Depending on what sector you're in, there's a whole range of different pieces or actions that you can take within your business to switch your operations as part of your transition strategy. There's a second element here around products and services. What we are prompting companies to think about is, are you changing the products that you're offering as part of your transition strategy? For example, if you're a food company, is there, do you have plans to shift towards more plant-based products? Are there plans to offer climate solutions? Are there changes, essentially, are there changes that you're making in the products and services that you offer? If you're a financial institution, for example, are you creating new financial products to help real economy decarbonization? Again, focusing on what are the steps that you're taking to actually put those in place. There's this third piece here around policies and conditions. So thinking through here, what are some internal policies that companies are putting in place to help deliver on the ambition that they're setting out? If you're a financial institution, these could be certain financing restrictions or conditions that you're putting in place. You could be implementing engagement policies where you're saying that accompanying investments in certain sectors, you're putting in place engagement plans. If you're in the real economy, you might have policies around integrating carbon pricing into your decision making. If you're a consumer goods company, you might have commitments around deforestation, zero deforestation commitments, where you're committing to across your value chain, things like that. What are the internal policies that you're putting in place in order to help you achieve the objectives that you've set out? Really crucially, there's the financial planning piece here, which is around understanding what this plans mean for you as a company in terms of expected financial effects and also how you're resourcing the plan. So if you look at kind of the elements 2.1 to 2.3, then what do you expect this will mean for your forward-looking CapEx investments? How will it change your forward-looking OpEx? What are the significant financial effects that you estimate this will have on your company? And then the fifth piece I want to dwell a bit around, which is assumptions and dependencies that you're making. So if you have certain objectives and priorities and you're developing an action plan to reach those, it is highly likely that there's certain assumptions that you're making around how the ecosystem is moving around you to help you assess whether you're actually going to reach the objectives that you set out, right? You're making, for example, you could make assumptions around how technology might evolve in the short and medium term. You could make assumptions around certain policies that are coming in, which are going to shape how you as a company are managing the transition. You are going to have dependencies on other actors in the ecosystem moving. So for example, if you've set scope 3 decarbonization targets, then the rate at which the grid is decarbonizing around you is going to be impacting whether or not you can achieve those targets, things like that. These are the pieces that we think under a transition plan should really be brought out, because it helps external users understand whether the actions that you're taking are likely are based on credible assumptions and are likely going to be sufficient to help you reach your objectives. So these are the consideration under implementation strategy. But one of the key, I think, messages of the TPT framework is that what you're doing internally as a company is only one part of the equation, which is why we are also recommending the next element, which, if we go to the next slide, which is around your engagement strategy. So here, the question is around the steps that you're taking to work with your value chain, your industry peers, as well as policymakers to help support your objectives. So again, what could this mean in terms of actions, right? If you're under 3.1, engagement with value chain, these could be steps that you're taking to engage with your suppliers to improve your scope 3 emissions data. This could be engaging with suppliers to help suppliers decarbonize. This could be working with your portfolio companies, with your financial institutions, to think through what financial offerings do you need to make in order to help them reach their decarbonization targets. This could be exercising shareholder voting rights. Engagement with industry could be looking at what you can do proactively to engage with the industry peers through industry alliances, to think through what are the common challenges that we face and what are the ecosystem blocks that need to be that we can collectively move in order to help our sector decarbonize. And then government, really crucially, is what are the steps that you're taking to engage with government and the public sector to communicate what your policy dependencies are. So, for example, if you're saying you can't reach your decarbonization targets without policy, certain enabling factors from the policy landscapes, then what steps are you taking to engage with policymakers and communicate that? What are you doing both directly and indirectly through industry alliances to help you achieve those objectives? And so again, across both of those, it's about setting out the concrete steps that you're taking, particularly over the short and medium term, and then communicating how those link and will help you deliver on the objectives. And which brings me to the next slide, which is then some high-level reflections and key takeaways that are really important across both of those elements. And so one of the things that we want to clearly communicate to preparers now is that even if you don't have all of the answers in place, it's important and perfectly possible to start early. It's perfectly possible to start steps even before you have, for example, a perfect Scope 3 greenhouse gas accounting of where your emissions lie. There are actions that you can take. The next piece is that this process will be iterative. So developing and putting in place the transition plan is about developing a strategy for the future. Now, there's going to be assumptions around how the market moves. Those assumptions will change as we see as time ticks on, and that will likely have impacts on your strategies. So what you set out today is you can expect that to change as over the next couple of years, and the plan that you set out for the next 10 years now won't be the same 3 years on. And expecting that from the get-go and knowing that those iterations will take place and thinking of this as more of a kind of a cyclical learning curve will help you get moving early. The third piece is, if you think through the different kind of considerations that I outlined here, it's quite likely that within a company, sustainability function in isolation won't be able to develop this, right? Because in order to develop your financial planning, you will need to talk to your finance functions. You will need to talk to different business units to understand what is possible now, what are the early steps that we can take. And building in that cross-functional collaboration from the get-go is going to be key in order to allow you to actually build that holistic transition plan and figure out where the levers that I have, which ones can I pull early, and where can I get going. Fourthly, the piece around understanding where your uncertainties, dependencies, and assumptions are really matters. So understanding again where your dependencies on policy, on technology development, where are you simply not sure, because there's a lot of I think in transition planning there's a whole lot of areas where there are uncertainties around how the policy landscape moves around, even if you just look backward looking around where we're in today, around where your emissions are, particularly on your Scope 3 value chain, etc. And being transparent to the market around what you know, what you don't know yet, and what steps you're taking to improve that knowledge is going to be important. And then the fifth piece is linking back a little bit to last week's, is that a good and credible transition plan, or one of the key factors, is that it links the long-term objectives that you set out to the short and medium-term actions that you're taking now. So throughout your transition plan, there should be that logical link should be really, really clear, where what you set out under your foundations in terms of the objectives needs to be backed up and clearly linked to the actions that can, and a company needs to be able to communicate, this is how the steps that I'm taking now will help me reach where I want to be in 10 to 15 years. And I think I'll probably end there as kind of a high-level input. I think on the next slide, this is just to say that the next webinar will then focus more on the accountability piece in terms of measuring progress and putting in place the governance system. So that's the discussion, I guess, that we're bracketing out a bit today. But with that, I think I'll leave it hand back. But I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ira. I think that gets us off to a really clear start. Thanks everybody for getting the questions coming in already as well. Some great stuff there that I'm looking forward to getting stuck into later. It's tempting to give you something now, Ira, but I think we'll wait. But do let me remind everyone to keep an eye on the Q&A and give a thumbs up if you see a question there that you'd like us to address. As I said at the start, there's a real likelihood we won't get to them all. So your help in prioritizing them will be invaluable. Okay, let's move on. And now we'll hear from Harriet.
Thanks so much, Steve. And I have to say it's such a pleasure hearing Ira speak on this topic. Such a wealth of knowledge. So I've also feel like things are very clear for me following that session. Hopefully I can also give you some thoughts on practical actions for transitioning to a low carbon world. A very big thanks to the Global Compact Network UK for inviting me. I'd definitely say we don't have all of the answers in this area. I don't think anyone does, but we are a great believer in the importance of sharing learnings to accelerate progress. And so I hope it's a useful session. I'm Harriet Howey, and I oversee the ESG Insights programme at Diageo. Diageo is a global beverage alcohol company. We have over 200 brands and sales in more than 180 countries. Now, some people haven't heard of Diageo, but almost everyone has heard of at least one of our brands, which include Johnnie Walker, Guinness, Bailey's, Smirnoff, Tanqueray Gin, among many others. We can just move on. So I won't spend a long time on this, but I did want to provide some context on our pathway to net zero. In 2020, we launched our Society 2030 Spirit of Progress ambition, and that's ultimately our strategic approach to managing our most important ESG issues. I always say that ESG is such a broad term, it's almost meaningless, and so it's really, really important for companies to do an assessment of what they should be focusing on and then setting targets in line with those focus areas. So for us, those focus areas consist of 3 pillars, underpinned by a foundation of doing business the right way from grain to glass. And the pillars are how we promote positive drinking, how we champion inclusion and diversity, and how we pioneer grain to glass sustainability, which of course is what we'll be focusing on today. And not only will we be talking about the actions we're taking in our own operations, but also, as Ira mentioned, the importance of what you do in your supply chain with your communities, as well as your advocacy efforts as well. So just moving on, a brief reminder, if you don't know, we do have targets in the area of carbon reduction. I know there's already been a session on the ambition pillar of transition planning, so I'll only talk about this briefly. But we've committed to achieve net zero across our entire business and value chain by 2050 or sooner. And we have 3 slightly shorter term targets for 2030, which aim to drive progress towards this ultimate ambition. And those are becoming net zero in our direct operations, that's scope 1 and 2 emissions, reducing our value chain emissions, or scope 3, by 50%, and making sure we're using 100% renewable energy for our own operations, all by 2030. And we're very proud that our carbon targets are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is, of course, means that they are in line with an ambition to reduce emissions according to the Paris Agreement. So just moving on, our approach to reaching net zero is underpinned by 4 key pillars of action: operations, supply chain, community, and advocacy. And in our own operations, we're aiming to do a number of things, but the biggest focus that we have is embedding energy efficiency wherever possible and working towards using 100% renewable electricity, fuel, and heat. Now, I can't and won't touch on everything we're doing in all of these areas. I'm just going to give you some examples to provide a bit of inspiration about the sort of thing that we're focusing on. But it's fair to say that decarbonising your own operations consists of a lot of different activities across all sorts of different areas. And all businesses will probably have a few areas that they need to focus on with the most energy and effort, and then areas that are important but probably can come slightly down in order of priority. So we look at energy efficiency, as I said, and we focus on 2 areas. Firstly, quite simply working out how we can reduce the energy we consume. And secondly, finding really smart ways to recover and reuse the energy that we do end up using. So some examples of energy reduction initiatives include things like improving insulation on cookers and stills, and optimizing compressed air and steam systems. And some examples of recovery and reuse include things like upgrading our brew houses to recover hot vapour and reusing heat from cooling water in our distilleries. So we're trying to be really smart and really efficient in how we approach those sort of initiatives. We're also really keen to convert our energy sources to renewable as well. And how we do that looks different depending on where in the world our business is. In some areas we may invest in on-site solar technology. In others we may be developing biomass solutions to replace fossil fuel fired boilers. And of course in some places we may be doing a combination of those things. Now, of course, action in your own operations is necessary, but by no means sufficient to drive the transition to a low carbon economy. So there are so many stakeholders that are relevant to this change, and that's why we also work with our supply chain and our communities, as well as taking an active advocacy role as well. So let's briefly touch a little bit more on supply chain. So moving on, there are a huge number of opportunities to accelerate transition by working with your supply chain. And I think sometimes the wealth and variety of opportunities can mean it's quite hard to know where to focus. And so for us, what was very important was having a look at sort of our supply chain and working out and calculating where the highest volume of emissions were coming from. And that meant we can really focus our efforts going forwards on where we can have the biggest impact. But of course, the impact can be anything from how we source our raw materials to how we package and distribute our products, all have the potential to cut our carbon emissions. We recognise this, and therefore a number of our targets and Spirit of Progress actually directly relate to these topics. So for the uninitiated, you may look at our targets and think, oh, they've got some targets on packaging and they've got some targets on recycled content and the weight of their packaging and also regenerative agriculture. And what those targets are actually doing is they're directly supporting our ambitions on reducing our Scope 3 goals. And there is a big way for companies to go in how they partner with their supply chain. And we are, like many companies, exploring all sorts of different opportunities. And we're trying to work on this in a way that's very collaborative, where we learn and we share our learnings with our suppliers and vice versa. And so those partnerships are really critical. And what's beautiful about this sort of work is that initiatives that help us to accelerate our own decarbonisation also have the potential to help other companies in our value chain decarbonise too. So a great example of this is a really exciting partnership with an organisation called NSERC, where we're working with them to develop a hydrogen-powered furnace, which will create the world's first net zero glass bottle at scale. This furnace aims to begin glass production in 2027, and by 2030, we hope that it will be producing up to 200 million net zero bottles of Smirnoff, Captain Morgan, Gordon's and Tanqueray gin per year. So that's a very exciting initiative and just one example of how we're partnering with our supply chain on reaching our Scope 3 target. So just moving on. Of course, collaboration can go beyond partnerships with suppliers and can also extend to things like advocacy and campaigning efforts. And we've recognised the importance of collaboration for a long time. We've actually been a participant of the UN Global Compact since 2002. We're very proud of that. I believe we were one of the founding members, but perhaps you can confirm, Steve, in Q&A, because I don't want to be speaking out of turn there. We do want to help accelerate climate action globally. And of course, being a participant in the UN Global Compact is part of this. Ultimately, we know that working together is the only way to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we are proud signatories to initiatives like the Race to Zero, the Race to Resilience. We also believe it's really critical for businesses to play their part in protecting the natural world. Nature, of course, is incredibly important in the fight against climate change. Nature and biodiversity are incredibly important from a systemic perspective, and therefore we do believe that companies have a role to play in considering nature and working in partnership to protect nature. So an example of this is fresh water, of course, is a key pillar of nature, and as a precious shared resource, we know it's coming under increasing pressure in many parts of the world. We believe it's really critical that we should play an active role in promoting water stewardship. And for that reason, we're signatories to things like the CEO Water Mandate, and also active members of the Water Resilience Coalition, which is an initiative of the CEO Water Mandate. And of course, last but not least, from a community perspective, we know that our Grain to Glass sustainability ambition is enabled by all stakeholders and stakeholder groups, from our own employees to our customers and consumers, and to the communities where our sites are located and where we source our raw materials. So communities will play and do play a vital role in the transition to a low carbon economy. So part of our work aims to consider how we actively engage the communities where we live, where we work, where we source and where we sell our products to ultimately drive climate action. An example of this is how we work with growers and smallholder farmers supplying our business to both pilot regenerative agriculture programs and promote those practices more broadly in order to support climate resilience opportunities and a regenerative approach to agriculture. And then just a couple of closing thoughts. So moving on, this is something I mention every time I discuss this topic, so forgive me if you've heard me speak on this before. It's the innovation gap. When we were developing our targets, we knew or we believed that if we knew how to reach those targets, then they weren't ambitious enough. And we felt certain that during the decade to 2030, new technology, new innovations, and more powerful collaborations would emerge to support progress towards our goals. And of course, as we've already said, we're not going to wait around for that to happen. We're also being proactive in pursuing opportunities to accelerate progress. The reason I'm mentioning this is because I want to reassure you, if there's any people from businesses on the call that are thinking about this, that key part of transition to a low carbon future is learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yes, there's uncertainty. Yes, there are lots of things we don't know yet, but what we do know that this work is important, it's critical, and that being ambitious is an integral part of making progress. Companies, by their very nature, are innovators. They invent new ways to overcome complex challenges all the time. And the transition to a low-carbon economy is arguably the biggest innovation challenge in history. And I hope that some of us can feel excited about that, as well as slightly daunted by the magnitude of the challenge. And last but not least, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. There is no one solution. You have to do lots of different things across your value chain with a range of stakeholders in order to make progress towards net zero. And if we just move on, you can see here a picture that we've taken of our agave plantation in Mexico through one of the drones that we're using to help map those fields and monitor and measure agricultural inputs. Also, I would really recommend having a bias for action and agility, as Ira has already said. Be prepared to evolve your approach as you learn. This is in line with the draft guidelines on transition planning that have already been released, which suggests you should publish a refreshed plan every few years, every 3 years or so. Collaboration is also key, as we've said. No one company can do this alone. Actions that help your company transition also have the potential to support your suppliers and customers to transition too. Everybody benefits. Nature and climate are also linked and should be considered in a holistic way. I would really urge you, when you're talking to your senior stakeholders, to make sure that you're bringing nature into the conversation and not just focusing exclusively on climate change. They'll thank you for it when the recommendations of the Taskforce on Nature-related Financial Disclosures come in, because it will help businesses be prepared to respond to those. And finally, last but not least, as we've said, innovation is key. Transition is ultimately an innovation question, and businesses have a strong track record of finding unique solutions to varied challenges. So hopefully this can be a real fuel for engagement and interest as your organisation looks to tackle some of these big entrenched challenges. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Steve, and I'll look forward to Supriya's session and the Q&A.
Thank you, Harriet. So much of what you said is just music to my ears. Well, firstly, let's get out of the way. You guys weren't amongst the founding 40 companies of Global Compact, but you were very, very early adopters, and for which we are continuously grateful, and of course, really appreciate your ongoing engagement. I have to commend your we talked about ambition last week, and it's really refreshing to see such ambitious targets for net zero, and also that they still stand after you've done transition planning as even greater credit to you. This came up in last week's session that some companies are reevaluating their net zero targets, having done the homework and looked at what the transition was going to entail. So again, really great. And I think that your comments around the innovation gap are so important, because that's really is, I think, to my mind, I completely agree with you that that's where true ambition rests, is committing to that little bit of a jumping into the unknown, and I think it's that kind of courage that we need to see from leading companies if we're gonna get where we need to go. So thanks very much, and looking forward to getting stuck into it further after we hear from Supriya. So over to you, Supriya. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Harriet and Ira, for their interesting presentation. So I'll talk to you about NatWest Group's initial climate transition plan, and we published this in our climate report in February earlier this year. So just from a context perspective, if we move on to the next slide, our transition plan, as a bank, NatWest's emissions, mainly the most material emissions, relate to the emissions on the lending we provide to our customers. So we have a big balance sheet, being one of the biggest banks in the UK, and a lot of that balance sheet on the asset side is lending to our customers in a lot of sectors. So in 2020, we set out our ambition to halve the climate impact of our financing activity, which is our lending and investment activity, by 2030 against a 2019 baseline. And then subsequently, we've also set ambitions to be net zero by 2050 for our lending, our operational value chain, as well as for our assets under management. So they are quite kind of significant overarching sort of ambitions that we have. The transition plan that I will talk you through primarily focuses on lending. As I said, most of our emissions come from lending to our customers and the emissions they generate. So we have initially prepared a transition plan covering about 72% of our 2019 lending book, which is our baseline from a timing perspective. So what did we consider when we were developing our transition plan? And some of these will sound familiar to the TPT guideline that Ira sort of talked through at the start. So as a bank, as I said, because our emissions are linked to our lending, we obviously wanted to see how our lending is changing between now and 2030. What are our forecasts? How do we align our transition plan to our financial plan? Because we want to make sure that the transition is embedded within our financial plan, our overall strategy. And it's the way we do things. It's not something that's standing alone on a side. It's part of our overall strategic kind of direction of how our balance sheet moves. So as part of that, then we looked at the products and services we could offer to our clients and our customers to support their transition. Because our emissions link to what our customers do, the actions in our transition plan are primarily linked to how we can support our customers to transition. So we looked at various sectors that we developed the transition plan for, to see what opportunities we could offer to our customers to support their decarbonisation and hence our own, and as well as the UK's. So these are sort of broad things we looked at in terms of what can we do for our customers, how can we work with them. Partnerships are really important as well, as Harriet mentioned earlier. And then how is our book evolving, and making sure the evolution of our balance sheet change aligns to the transition. On the next slide, we obviously recognize the dependency. As Harriet mentioned, there's the innovation gap. For us, because we are supporting our customers, there is also a significant dependency on how customers react to the actions we take. Because we can offer a lot of green products, we can come up with a lot of products and services, but unless customers avail of this, the transition will not happen. So there is a dependency on customers, there's a dependency on technology changes to support customers move and become greener. And then obviously there's also a dependency on the government. There are a lot of policies that are in chain based on the UK's Committee for Climate Change 6th Carbon Budget. So we looked at all those policies to see how would they change sort of the technical environment or innovation or product environment in the future, what levers will it give our customers? Because policies are sometimes an incentive that the customers need to then move towards greener. So say, for example, in the automotive sector, we know there are policies in place to roll off internal combustion engine vehicles and bring in electric vehicles, right? So that is providing both manufacturers of vehicles as well as consumers to move to electric vehicles. So policy sometimes leads to customer action. So we've kind of recognized that dependency we have on policies as well. The Committee for Climate Change published their report last year, where they sort of ranked the various policies in terms of how well they were progressing, where they had plans, which policies were credible or not. And then we've used that assessment to say how we see these policies coming and impacting our transition plan. So that's the sensitivity kind of component of the transition planning task force guidance. So getting into the nitty-gritty of our transition plans. So we've developed our transition plans by sector. So if you move on to the next slide, and I'll take you through some of the examples of the types of actions we are taking with our customers and across the system. Because we know we cannot do this on our own. No one person or one bank or one institution can do this on our own. We're all in this together. So our actions sort of span across a range. So, they start with customer engagement and education and knowledge sharing, because as we said, we need our customers to know that we are here to support their decarbonization, what products we have, and why decarbonization is important, and have the conversations with them to support them think about what they can change, how they can have more sustainable practices in manufacturing or farming, etc. So for our mortgage sector, we started off with helping customers understand their EPC data, which is the energy performance certificate, we are using it as to estimate emissions. We're one of the first banks to provide our customers, retail customers, on their app. They can see their carbon footprint based on sort of the spending they make. Again, that's an education piece. So once they know what their carbon footprint is, then they can assess how to reduce that. And the app provides sort of some ideas as well. So that's basic education sort of levers that we are using to support our customers. Then is launching products. So we have, in the mortgages sector, we have a suite of green mortgage products. So if customers buy a greener mortgage, i.e. more energy efficient mortgage, we provide them with a discount. Similarly, when they remortgage or etc. And we're also working across the sector. So we're part of the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, again, looking across the systems to see what support we can provide to the construction sector, to the mortgage sector, etc., to support greener buildings. And looking at mobility, again, it's a similar way in providing greener finance, so financing more electric vehicles, having policies in place to make sure we are lending to the right customer profile. So transition is as much about making sure sort of our lending in the future is greener, as well as working with our book that we currently have and support their decarbonization. So we're making sure the actions we are taking support both. We have an overarching target to provide 100 billion of climate and sustainable funding and financing between the 1st of July 21 and the end of 25, and specifically within that 10 billion to mortgage customers between 23 and 25 to support greener buildings and greener mortgages. So moving on, we then also looked at sort of the energy sector. So energy includes oil and gas and electricity generation. Electricity impacts all sectors, right? Because our scope 2 emissions, most of our scope 2 emissions are electricity for us and everybody else. So if we look at the next slide, there's some actions we've taken, obviously, particularly on the energy sector on financing renewable lending. So, generation of electricity through renewable sources. We also have specific policies regarding coal and oil and gas customers. We ran a credible transition plan assessment for oil and gas majors to assess which ones passed in terms of our assessment and taking further actions on the customers that were unsuccessful, and then continue to provide transition finance. In terms of the food sector, which is mainly agriculture and the associated sectors, again, financing, supporting sustainable agriculture practices, financing that. You may have recently read that we entered into a partnership with McCain, who are the frozen potato link. So to provide potato farmers that McCain work with financing solutions to support their transition, which we will contribute to, and so will McCain. So we are working across the sector to make sure there's opportunities available either directly to our customers or through different channels to our customers. We've also developed transition plans for financial assets, financial institutional lending, as well as assets under management. But if we move on to the next slide, what does this mean for our transition plan? What was the outcome? And where are we today? So as you will see, these are the systems I touched upon in terms of mortgages, mobility, etc. We have made good progress. We have identified actions. You can see the energy system has a green against it, whereas the others are red or amber. All this shows is there is more to do, both from us, from our customers, from a policy perspective, and from sort of the system perspective. And we are continuing to develop our transition plan. This is why we said what we have published just now is the initial iteration, and we'll continue to build on it. And how do we build on it? So if you look at the next slide, so through last year, we worked on identifying actions by sector, because we were wanting to make sure we do the right thing by sector and for our customers in specific sectors. But what we have learned through doing that is we need to look across the piece. So as an example, one of the actions we've identified in the mortgage sector is that we need to provide support to our customers to retrofit their property. So if they are living in an energy inefficient home, how do we provide financing to make it more efficient? However, there is a dependency our mortgage customers have on the construction sector to have a supply chain to come and do the work. So we are then also working with the supply chain sector and the construction sector to make sure there's workforce available. So what we've now said is that while we've started off at a sector level, we want to now look at across the systems. So and on the right side, you can see the various systems we're looking at. And this is just an illustration to say that the answers for decarbonization don't necessarily lie within a silo. They lie across kind of a wider system. And to support decarbonization and move that on, we need to look beyond sort of just kind of that siloed set of customers or sectors. So very quickly, our next steps on the next slide, we kind of our transition plan that we published were guided by the TPT. And we published this little linkage as to how we worked with the various TPT draft guidance that was available at that time. And as that develops, we'll continue to develop our transition plans. We're also continuing to enhance the linkage between our transition planning and our financial planning, because we want to make sure that's really embedded and works as one process. And as we do it, move further and further, it will sort of develop. And then really make sure that climate is included within the decision making. You know, as a bank, as an industry, or generally, we're all familiar with profit, you know, income, this, that, and those terms. And normally when we think about performance, you just go to those terms, but climate is a term that needs to be mentioned in the same vein as other metrics that we use to measure our performance. And we're working to make sure that climate is embedded in our decision making and continue to enhance our transition plans. So I'll close there and hand back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Supriya. And so let's drop those slides out of there and have everybody with this cameras on. Fabulous. Thank you so much. Supriya, I think same goes. I think it's really refreshing to see a company that's taking on that really, what I think is one of the most important themes of the work of the TPT, that you're not just focusing on your own impacts, but it's about how can you shape the wider ecosystem, and how can you contribute to the whole country reaching net zero by 2050. And that's obviously, you play such an important role in that, given the scale of your operations in the country. Yeah, it's again really great to see that kind of leadership. So thank you on behalf of whoever I'm thanking you on behalf of for doing that. All right. We've had lots of great questions come in, and I think we'll just get stuck into those straight away, but maybe a final, happy to have more questions come in, but we really need you guys to vote. We've got almost 500 people on this call, and so it's looking like just over only 10% of you have gone in there and cast votes for the questions you want us to answer. So I think it's a sure thing we're not going to get through them all. So to make sure we're talking about the things that you care about the most, get in there, cast some votes. and we'll all use our time most effectively. So Eugene's question is miles ahead, and we know that the questions around offsets, it could easily be an entire session on its own. And in fact, we've done some sessions on offsets in the past. So I don't want to get too into it. And I noted already that Harriet has kindly done a written answer for a question that came in from Sandra. So maybe we'll just start with you, Ira, if I may. And just, does the TPT have a view? I know Science Based Targets Initiative has a very strong view on this. Where does TPT stand?
Yeah, happy to come in on that. I think there's two messages here. First of all, we do reference the work that the Science Based Targets Initiative has done on here, and the work that they've done on establishing the mitigation hierarchy as a core principle in terms of companies needing to prioritize direct emissions reductions before purchasing offsets. And we reference that in two places. First of all, under the ambition principle in terms of setting out what is an ambitious approach. And we highlight that in the implementation guidance as well. And then the second piece where the TPT comes in here is we very clearly recommend that where companies do rely on carbon credits and offsets, they're very transparent about those. They report against those separately from their greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and they provide supplementary information that can help users assess the credibility and the quality of those offsets as well. So there's prompts in our framework around being transparent around, first of all, the extent to which you're relying on carbon credits, but also what, if any, third-party verification are you relying on? What type of carbon credit is this? Are you working with nature-based removals? Is this technological removals? Are these avoidance-based emissions? These types of questions, so that when companies communicate their transition strategy, it's very easy for users to see the role that offsets play in that strategy, so that users ultimately can come to an assessment about that.
Okay, and that does sound quite consistent with where the Science Based Targets Initiative has landed on this as well. Supriya, anything to add? Is NatWest using offsets now, or is it in your plans?
So we are, as I mentioned in my actions, we are working on real economy actions. So our targets are validated by the SBTi as well. So we follow the SBTi guidance, but agree with Harriet in terms of we do need to focus on real economy actions before we even think about offsets.
And I'll be really transparent at the moment. We talk about it in our net zero strategy. We do talk about the use of offsets, but there's lots of other things that we're focusing our efforts on more with more energy.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's really almost a prioritization question. There's clearly going to be a need for carbon removals in the future, because action hasn't started when it should have done, and we've got ourselves behind. But it's not the area where companies should be focusing their attention at this time. I think that's really the way you expressed it, Harriet, was brilliant, and clearly got a lot of support from our audience. So fabulous. Eugene, I hope we've addressed your question. So now let's move on to a question from Karen Jameson. How does a climate transition plan differ to a carbon reduction plan? We had a very generous offer come in in the chat from David Bramley Crawshaw, formerly of the Cabinet Office, and someone who was intimately involved in developing the government's carbon reduction plan scheme. So David has kindly provided us with some text that we're going to pop in there as a written answer. But now, having said that, it probably made it very intimidating for any of you to want to comment on this question. But Ira, do you want to step in? It's a bit more technical, and I imagine you've looked at this.
Yeah, we have. I think the easiest way to explain it is that a credible transition plan is the carbon reduction plan plus a little bit more. So thinking through what you can do to decarbonize your own operations, that's essentially the core of the decarbonization plan. But as I said at the beginning, right, what the TPT is really trying to push and encourage is that companies think beyond that and think, where are other levers that I have to help the ecosystem around me decarbonize? Because ultimately the goal is to transition an entire economy and to transition a global economy, and not to transition individual balance sheets. And that's I think where the TPT's guidance then goes just a little bit further and thinking through, okay, what are the other levers that I have? Which, right, I think with both NatWest and Diageo, right, that was really credibly explained today in terms of how can you think through extra steps that you're taking beyond that decarbonization piece. So that's probably the easiest way to explain how those two link together.
Supriya, Harriet, anything to add?
I think Ira's covered it from my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, again, we really want that, circling right back to the beginning of our presentation today and the Sustainable Development Goals. Certainly think, while a focus on carbon reduction is obviously really critical and needs to be a top priority, we want that couched within a more holistic approach to sustainability that considers nature and social impacts along the way. And I think that's one of the strengths of the TPT recommendations, is that it does that. Okay, let's move on to Chloe's question. How can we support supply chain actors with their own transition plans? So I think in this, why don't we say value chain actors, and then that opens it up, Supriya, to all of the work you're doing with customers, because I think that the parallels are so obvious. Do you want to start maybe just recapping some of what you were saying about what you're already doing there? And is it, yeah, because I think you've been quite explicit about transition plans, with at least in the oil and gas sector.
Yeah, so we, as you mentioned, in the oil and gas sector, we have assessed our customers' transition plan, the major oil and gas customers' transition plan, to assess whether they do transition and whether they have the right targets, whether those targets are supportable, whether they have action plans, etc. So we've done that assessment. We're now also working to roll out that to wider customers, so developing a methodology for that, which is in progress, and we're testing kind of various methodologies. We also, from our supply chain perspective, we also have a supply chain charter where we interact with our suppliers and assess what targets they may be setting, etc. So that's part of our part of the process of selection of suppliers. And then we also have environmental, social, and ethical policies to really make sure that the customers we're dealing with have that wider they're not in any way harming the environment, or have the right social and ethical standards as well. So there's quite a few angles into it, and then also the work we're doing to support the economy decarbonization that will also help our customers who will be suppliers to other businesses to support their decarbonization as well. So I think as a bank, we linked in through our own supply chain, but then also through supporting our customers to promote this decarbonization and providing the customers with the help they need to do that.
As you said, system change creates conditions that enable your customers and your suppliers to advance. Yeah. Harriet, you've also quite advanced in terms of how you're engaging your supply chain, and very ambitious targets there. How are you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I also don't want to say that we're quite advanced. We are trying very hard, but we have a lot to learn, like other companies. And one of the big things in terms of that learning is partnership. So we really welcome new thinking in working with our suppliers, and we want to collaborate with them to innovate. Our emissions targets are part of our partnering with suppliers standard and are reflected in things like our sustainable procurement practices. So we are trying to build it into how we do business, and I think that's really, really important. The other thing that we do is that we do share some of the sustainability challenges we're facing, and in order to meet our goals through our Diageo Sustainable Solutions Programme. And that programme aims to kind of find innovators that we can partner with to pilot solutions and then ultimately scale them for the benefit of our business, but also for the benefit of other businesses. And the final thing that I'd say is we really actively encourage our suppliers to participate in emissions reporting through our membership of the CDP supply chain programme. And we want to really support suppliers to do that through things like webinars, toolkits, and training programmes, because we recognise that this is difficult, and And we're a large company with experience in this area, and some of our suppliers might be much smaller and much less experienced. So all of those elements are things which we think are really useful, and we'll continue to learn and innovate as time goes on.
Thank you. Okay, next up, a really interesting question from David Starley. How would you go about persuading senior stakeholders that the existing business model is not, went away too fast. There we go. Would you go about persuading senior stakeholders that the existing business model is not compatible with the requirements of the transition plan and that the products and services will have to change? Now, I suppose you guys are somewhat sheltered from this question, but not entirely. Supriya, I could see that, I mean, it's already sort of happening, isn't it? That you're eliminating things from your book. So that.
Yeah, so as I said, obviously we've set our ambition in terms of decarbonization, and then we're also supporting our customers to decarbonize in the broader scheme of the UK's decarbonization and the global decarbonization, as Ira mentioned. In terms of getting buy-in and senior stakeholder support and changing business models, I think, as I mentioned, we are really clear that climate and our climate ambitions are a key part of our strategy. And it's almost kind of the tone from the top. And that message is very clear. As part of our decision making, we are working to give climate sort of equal weighting as we do to other kind of traditional metrics. And that does result in some trade-off discussions, because obviously every decision isn't easy, and some decisions are carbon friendly but not, other metrics friendly, and vice versa. But then we are having those conversations at fairly senior levels to really make sure that any decisions we make are the right decisions and are made for the right reasons. And obviously there was another question in terms of the just transition comes into this as well, right? Because you can't really make decisions from this will reduce carbon, let's stop this. That may not be the right answer. And I think this is where we are looking from a systems perspective to say where is the right lever to pull for the decarbonization in a certain sector. And as I mentioned, for mortgages, the lever may lie in the construction sector, and that's where we are then trying to identify the actions to take to support then the supply chain into the mortgage sector. So I think this is where that holistic systems approach is quite important rather than rash decisions. But in terms of getting that buy-in, I think our board, our sustainable banking committee, etc., these are all live discussions we have at a fairly senior level to make sure we're heading in the right direction from a carbon and climate perspective, balancing the other metrics.
Harriet, have you had?
I mean, I suppose it's a bit difficult we're not like a car company making lots of kind of petrol fueled cars. So it's like, another example of a company that's highly vulnerable to the transition to a low carbon economy in terms of their current business model. What I would say as a general principle for engaging senior stakeholders is it's really critical to involve them in the conversations from the beginning. When you do your ESG impacts assessments, make sure that you're talking to your board, make sure you're talking to your executive committee, and taking into account their views, bring them on the journey in the development of your ambition, and then make sure you're regularly updating them against the progress on the progress of that ambition as well. So in the past, it was fairly common for sustainability to be siloed within companies, within a team of people who were sustainability experts who focused on this as 100% of their day job. Now that time has passed. This has to be a topic and an issue that every part of the business considers, that's woven into the DNA of your organisation and is considered in how you do business. That's not easy, and companies are on a journey to do this, but the sponsorship of your senior stakeholders is a really, really critical part of that. And so involving them at an early stage and making sure that they are kept up to date on progress is really, really critical. And if necessary, bring in outside experts, show them what other companies are doing in your peer group. Have other companies come and talk to you. There is a place for collaboration with your peers on topics like this that is really important and impactful. And all of those things can be really, really helpful in in engaging the most important senior stakeholders within your business on this topic?
It's frankly, at least from the outside, it looks like this is something that NatWest and Diageo have cracked, and that you've got, good support from your corporate leadership to make these transitions. Ira, presumably though, it's a big tent, and you recognize the need to work with companies that may not necessarily have that support. Is this something that you're working on? Have you got some tips or some tools for people that are needing to persuade their leadership?
I mean, I'll caveat this with saying that obviously I don't come at this from the practitioner perspective, right? What I have done over the past year of working with the TPT, I've had quite a few conversations with preparers that are at very different stages in the journey here, and with sustainability teams that have different levels of buy-in. And I think I've asked a few of these questions in terms of how do you take management on the journey? And I think the one angle that was fed back from a few people is that what really helps is clearly laying out why this is also in the interest of the company, right? We're at a level where climate change isn't something that's happening in 15 years. This is something that's starting to happen over the short and medium term. We're likely to start seeing increased physical impact. I mean, we see the transition impacts in terms of policy shifts are already happening with things like the IRA coming in the US. There are market disruptions that are already coming in right now, which means that regardless of where you really are in the economy, this is going to have an impact on you. And it makes sense to do what you can to move now, because the people that are moving now and moving early are those are going to be the companies that are going to be most resilient to this transition, right? It's the people that are taking the strategic forward-looking piece now. And landing that message, at least this is what we've heard through conversations, landing that message early with senior leadership can really help open the doors for pushing that conversation. And so I think one of the reasons why I think TCFD was such an important initiative, because it started building in that conversation around what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and starting to open those doors. But yeah, I think that's my 2 cents, again, not from a preparer perspective.
Thank you. No, that's great. Okay, let's move on. Question from Alexandra Floria. How can SMEs engage in transition plans? We will struggle to take the majority of these actions, especially around Scope 3, government and suppliers engagement, and financing the transition plan. Now, let me just, Alexandra, direct your attention to, there was a question from Marta where we did put in a written answer, just directing, and there's a link there. Maybe we can put that link in the chat again as well, Pauline. We're running a series on environmental sustainability for SMEs that is going to try and help SMEs navigate this. But maybe, Ira, we come to you with this one, and where does the TPT stand on smaller companies and expectations there?
So I'll be quite transparent that the documents that we launched for consultation in November, they don't say a whole lot on SMEs at the moment. I think there is the existing work that I know of that can be quite helpful is if you look at, and I can post the link as an answer to the question as well. There is some guidance from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which set out investor expectations for real economy transition plans, and they do have a segment where they outline what they think priority areas and sub-elements are for SMEs. I think that's useful guidance to look at right now. I think there is a piece where SMEs come in terms of, if you look at bigger companies and their transition plans in their engagement strategy piece. That's I think where SMEs are going to play a role. But that's where our guidance is at the moment. Something that we're hoping to work more on, but definitely important question to ask. And I'll pop the link in here now.
Great, thanks, Ira. But Harriet, in your supply chain, Supriya, with your customers, maybe Harriet, we start with you. Presumably, you're not going in with an expectation that somebody's going to have a small company is going to have a transition plan that aligns to the TPT disclosure framework right away. What sort of guidance? What are you prioritizing? What are you asking them to disclose now to to give you the confidence you need that they're on the right track?
So I mean, just going back to what I said earlier, for us, like participating in emissions reporting through CDP is super helpful, and it benefits. If a supplier does that once, then they've kind of discharged their duties across all of their customers, which we want to, that's what we should be focusing on, sort of efficiency. And sometimes we're on the receiving ends of lots of different questionnaires on similar topics that are worded in slightly different ways. And so what we've done over the years is prioritize how can we put information in the public domain which everybody can use, which is useful and transparent. And so that's through our reporting, and it is also through our participation in things like the CDP climate and water questionnaires as well. But we recognise this is a journey that lots of companies are on at different stages, and we want to be supportive and collaborative, and as I've said, offer the right guidance where possible and where helpful. And I'm sure that we'll learn more and become more sophisticated in our approach to this area. We certainly don't have all of the answers, but we recognise it's a very, very important part of making progress.
Maybe I could ask Pauline, put you to work again, if we could get a link to the CDP supply chain program into the chat, that might be helpful. Supriya, I imagine different levels, right? You're probably asking a lot more from oil and gas companies in terms of a transition plan than you are from an SME retailer or some other sector.
Yeah, so we recognize that SMEs, today, similar to farmers, say, for example, in the agriculture sector, don't have the tools to calculate emissions and measure emissions and draw out the transition plan. So we have actually launched a tool called the Carbon Planner, which SMEs can access, not just our customers, but wider, to kind of, they can input their data, and that will give them an estimated carbon emissions, which then also gives them ways or ideas that they can reduce their carbon emissions. And if they kind of work through that, you could almost start having a skeleton of the transition plan. So as I said, our actions kind of start with education. So first for the SMEs to understand what their carbon impacts are, and then some actions that they can then use to plan, and then also see the impacts as they implement those actions. So we put the tools out there, and I think as customers and other SMEs use them, then that will hopefully support their decarbonization and hence ours as well.
Okay, thank you all. Next question came in from Benjamin Porcel. How are business growth and increased activity driven by business growth factored into business planning within a transition plan? Ira, can I come to you with that one? Yeah.
Yeah, I can maybe give the high level conceptual answer, but I'd be keen to hear whether others want to supplement. So I think the main message here is it should be factored in, right? The exam questions under the business planning piece is given the expectations of the way that your company will develop, and this includes if you're expecting certain segments of your company to grow over time, if you're expecting certain segments of your certain product areas to grow over time, how are you planning to reach the objectives that you've set out despite that growth? How are you achieving that growth while also being in line with your targets, right? That's the exam question that companies need to solve for, I guess. So that can involve, right, things like, again, how are you, if you need to build new production facilities, then what energy efficiency measures are you making sure factoring in renewable energies from the get-go, right? Those types of considerations, right? How are you planning to reach that growth whilst being in line with the overall objectives? That's I think under the implementation strategy piece, what companies essentially need to answer. But yeah, I'd be keen to hear Supriya, Harriet, whether you have things to supplement there.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, that in considering and developing our transition plan, we have worked with the financial planning sort of and made sure that we are working to align our transition plan and our financial plan. So it shouldn't be that our climate ambitions are sitting in a separate silo and the rest of the bank is moving in a different direction. So we have sector by sector sort of looked at what our balance sheet is looking like going out to the external years. And then how do we factor in the actions we have identified through our transition plan, and whether they are kind of bringing the change that we need them to change to achieve our decarbonization ambitions. So we are working closely, and all the actions that kind of I took you through and the other actions we are putting in place is to support kind of that shift in the shape of the balance sheet that we will track both through the financial planning process, but then the wider transition planning process to make sure sort of we're making the right progress. So it's very much something we are working on.
Harriet, anything to add? No. Okay. Let's move on.
Sorry, I've just had a message saying my internet connection is unstable.
Oh, okay. Well,
Apologies,
you're
I've
okay.
seen a launch.
Did you hear the
Come back to
question?
me. I did. I did. And I think in answer to the question, it depends on the business, and the businesses should be factoring in. And as with many aspects of transition planning, there's a number of assumptions that you have to make, which may need to be refined over time. You know, I should be really transparent. We have a net zero strategy, but what we have published currently is not what I would consider to be a transition plan. There's a lot more work that companies can do in this area to meet all of the pillars of the draft guidelines. But of course, it is very important because we have absolute targets rather than relative targets, and therefore we need to factor in growth as part of our carbon reduction ambitions. And otherwise you'll be in a position where if your business grows year on year, so does your carbon, and so it's a critical part of that transition. And it's difficult because there, like I said, you're having to make assumptions over a much longer period of time than you would normally make. You normally do financial planning.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Chrysula writes, and I'm not sure about this one, Chrysula. How do you get confidence that your suppliers are making the progress you request? How do you audit their work and data? And I'm quite tempted to kick this down the road to next week when we're talking about accountability. But it's that kind of engaging suppliers piece that makes me want to just perhaps mention, maybe we could just briefly address this. Harriet, what sort of proof are you looking for in your supply chain? Is it as formal as that?
I'm going to be very honest and say that I'm not very close to this work because it's something that's taken by our sustainable procurement team, and I don't want to give you any information that's inaccurate. We do audit our suppliers on a number of different areas, and we do that through our own audits and through the SEDEX Members Ethical Trade Audit Programme as well. At the moment, I don't think those sort of audits take into account carbon, but let me look into it and come back to you, and maybe you can include it in your session next week if there's questions along the same lines. Yeah,
I expect that there will be.
But again, I just go back to CDP.
Yeah,
CDP is the answer on all of these things, in terms of not all of these things, but it's a very, very critical part of helping suppliers to report in a way that companies can act upon.
Supriya, anything to add there in terms of how you're getting evidence from your customers, more perhaps in your case, but also your suppliers?
I think from a customers, as I mentioned, we're developing transition plan, a customer transition plan assessment methodology that we are currently testing internally and that we plan to roll out gradually to our customers to kind of, obviously it will start with a few sectors and then kind of extend out. In terms of our suppliers, we have a supply chain charter, and that includes certain considerations that we expect suppliers to have from an environmental perspective. Again, I'm not very close to what exact kind of evidence we collect from them, but our guidelines are quite clear in terms of the expectations from our suppliers.
Okay, thank you. I like this question from Bev Hall. Not something we've touched on yet. Are there any good examples on how this is communicated to workers and how they are included in planning for change? I think that internal comms piece is so important. How do you get everybody along for the ride? Harriet, has that been a big part of the
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say, I mean, transition planning is quite a technical thing, you know, and the transition plan task force guidelines are the sort of thing that somebody like me would be very interested in and very in the detail of. But ultimately what we're talking about is, how do you communicate to your employees that you're decarbonising your business and decarbonising your value chain, and how do you help them get involved? And those are really, really important things, not least because you need all of your employees to be working with you on this transition, but also because so many employees really care about this now, and they want to work for businesses who are making efforts to tackle climate change, because it means a lot to them personally. And so for us, that's something that we've done through a whole range of different areas. From the very top, we've run an education program for our most senior leaders across Diageo, which encompasses about 600 people. It's a program that we've designed in partnership with Oxford University, and it's designed to sort of educate them on the importance of being a sustainable business in both the social and environmental realms, and what they can do as business leaders to build in attention to these issues into how they do business every day. And beyond that, we have a whole range of engagement programs that are led kind of from the bottom up, with people who are part of our kind of action group on spirited progress across the whole organisation. We have regular calls where we share good practice. Our employee engagement team is really heavily involved in communicating what we're doing in this area. Our CEO often talks about it in the blogs that he does to the full organisation, and then he sometimes has guest bloggers from other parts of the organisation who talk about it. And then the final thing is that we've built in a couple of questions on the topics of environmental and social sustainability into our annual employee engagement survey, trying to understand if people know about the programme, and if they know about the programme, they know how to implement actions within their own role to help progress. And that means we can really target interventions at part of the business that have said, actually, I don't know how I can do this, or I'm not clear on what the programme is. And that's been a really, really helpful lever for action as well. And this isn't something that happens overnight. So starting and learning and iterating and continually improving in how you engage your employees is exactly the same as starting and learning and iterating in how you decarbonise your business. It's the same sort of principles. You're not going to have all the answers straight away.
Supriya, how's it going in NatWest?
Yeah, so we last year announced a collaboration with the University of Edinburgh to really support the education within the organisation. So this year last year we designed the Climate Change Fundamentals course, which was like a 6 sort of short and sharp sessions that about 64,000 colleagues in the bank have completed. We've also worked to design role-specific training specifically for relationship managers who deal with the customers, to really help educate them, have the right conversations with customers, you know, A, why is this important, but then B, how can they support customers to decarbonize? So we have both kind of a generic training program for kind of a wide mass of employees, but then also role-specific tailored programs for specific employees to really help them and equip them, have the right conversations with the customers and support their decarbonization. So it's a very prevalent topic in the organization, and we are just making sure that, you know, employees have the tools to do their best in terms of carrying out the roles they have.
Ira, is there anything more guidance from TPT on the actual process internally, or is this
there is a little bit more under that, the piece around accountability in terms of how do you build in the governance systems internally. There's a piece there around touching on how does this impact your culture, how you take this forward within your own staff. I think there's a really interesting link here, both not only in terms of the upskilling angle, but there is also a just transition angle, which I find really interesting around this question, which is something that the TPT does touch on in our current guidance, that it's just important to keep in mind as you transition what the potential impacts and opportunities for your own workforce, but also the communities that you operate in are, and that transition plans should communicate those and outline these steps that companies are taking to mitigate those. Just plugging that the TPT also has a just transition working group that is looking at those recommendations at the moment, providing further insights there, and that we hope to do more work on this, because this is going to be, right, this, I think Harriet in the beginning talked around the need to think about nature at the same time. I think thinking about equity and the equity impacts of your transition plan at the same, those are all super interconnected and to be looked at holistically. And yeah, so that's something that we're trying to encourage firms to do.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to have to leave the rest of the excellent questions on the table and invite you all back again next week, where maybe we can take those on. I'd like to uncharacteristically end on time today. So huge thank you to Ira, to Harriet, and to Supriya for your fantastic insights and for sharing your time and knowledge so generously today. Big thank you to David for your unexpected intervention on carbon plans. Thanks to everybody for all of your great engagement in the chat and all of the fantastic questions that made this such an interesting conversation. Coming up from the UN Global Compact, but before I do, I just was thinking I was gonna give a big plug when we were talking about employee engagement. Those of you that are already in the Global Compact, those of you that are not, the UN Global Compact Academy is an online learning platform that is available to every employee of Global Compact participating companies wherever they are in the world. It can be a fabulous resource for trying to educate your workforce about climate and the actions that you're taking and why you're taking them. So if you want to learn more about the Academy, do get in touch with us. Up next in this series, as we mentioned, we're going to be looking at accountability next week. It's a final session in the series. We've got speakers coming from SSE and the London Stock Exchange Group, and we'll be looking at how you can ensure your plans are credible and providing decision useful information to investors and other stakeholders. That's on the 25th of May at the same time as today. I hope you'll be able to join us. Something else we're doing that's really relevant to this whole conversation is our Dialogue for Growth. We're launching this on the theme of making every job a climate job. And I think the idea is that we've all got a stake in this. Whatever your role is in a company, there's going to be a connection back to climate. And a big part of that and how we can have an impact is in developing the interpersonal skills we need to effectively engage colleagues on sustainability challenges. And so we're going to start talking about it with this launch event. And then in the autumn, we're going to be running a series of workshops. So joining this session will be a great way to learn more about that. And then lastly, again, linked into transition plans and the whole complicated corporate sustainability reporting ecosystem, we're going to be running a series of 3 sessions on the week of the July 4th through 6th, looking at corporate sustainability reporting, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. When the session ends, you're going to get a pop-up asking you to complete a brief survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback so that we can improve these sessions and make sure that next week meets your needs. So please do that. And that's all from me. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the sunshine for the rest of the afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you again really soon. Have a great day.